I've wrangled lighting grids for rock gods who demanded laser shows synced to their cat's heartbeat. I've balanced the power load for a 3-day festival in the middle of a desert, making sure the headliner's 1.2 million watt ego was matched by his on-stage glow. I've argued with fire marshals, placated furious tour managers, and once had to rewire a 70-foot video wall with a multi-tool and a prayer 10 minutes before showtime. I thought I had seen the face of unreasonable, soul-crushing pressure. But I'd never known true existential fear until I held the crisp, beige-colored envelope from the Harmony Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The letterhead alone was a masterpiece of passive aggression. The font was a serene, calming script, but the paper felt stiff with judgment. Inside, the charge was laid bare, a violation so heinous it required the cold, impersonal touch of a laser printer. My welcome mat. The one that read, "Hope you brought tacos and tequila." Apparently, this was a flagrant violation of Bylaw 74, Section C, Subsection 2. Doormats must contain only generic, non-commercial, non-alcoholic greetings. Approved examples include, but are not limited to, welcome, hello, or home sweet home. I read it 3 times, certain it was a prank, a welcome wagon gag for the new guy. I'd just moved in 3 weeks ago, seeking refuge from the chaotic hum of city life and the relentless travel of my job. Harmony Creek was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where the loudest noise was a sprinkler and the biggest drama was whose petunias were the most vibrant. I wanted boring. I craved beige. I just hadn't realized beige was a prerequisite for my front door accessories. An hour later, there was a knock. Not a friendly, neighborly knock. This was a precise, rhythmic rapping, like a metronome set to disapproval. I opened the door to a woman who looked like she was sculpted from condensed PTA meeting minutes. She was probably in her late 50s, with a haircut that was both a helmet and a threat. She wore a visor, despite being under my covered porch, and clutched a thick, 3-ring binder to her chest like a holy relic. "Mr. Jensen?" she asked, her voice as crisp as the letter. "Alex is fine," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "I am Carol Davison, president of the Homeowners Association," she announced. She didn't offer a hand, just a slight, tight-lipped nod. "I'm here to follow up on the correspondence regarding your entryway textile." "My entryway textile," I repeated slowly, letting the term roll around in my mouth. "You mean the doormat? The one that has tragically offended the neighborhood's delicate sensibilities with its pro-taco agenda?" Her eyes, small and sharp, narrowed. She did not appreciate sarcasm. It was probably a violation of Bylaw 28, Regulation of Tonal Inflection. "The bylaws are in place to maintain community standards and protect property values, Mr. Jensen," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on her binder of doom. "Your mat promotes a celebratory atmosphere that can be disruptive." I stared at her, genuinely dumbfounded. "It's a mat, Carol. It's not a rave. No one is doing tequila shots on it. I think the property values will survive." "Nevertheless," she clipped, "it is a violation. You have 48 hours to rectify the situation before official fines are levied." And with that, she turned on her sensible, beige-colored walking shoes and marched back across my perfectly manicured, HOA-approved lawn. I watched her go, then looked down at the mat. For a brief, insane moment, I considered going to war for it. I pictured myself on the local news, a taco in one hand, a bottle of Patron in the other, a modern-day Patrick Henry fighting for the right to a festive greeting. Then I sighed, went to Target, and bought a mat that just said, "Hello." The fight wasn't worth it. Or so I thought. The Gnome Wars, as I later came to call them, began 2 weeks after the Great Doormat capitulation. My girlfriend Amy, who found the whole HOA situation hilarious, thought my front yard needed a touch of whimsy to counteract the beige oppression. She bought me a small, classic garden gnome. A little guy with a red hat, a white beard, and a fishing pole. We put him next to a rose bush, half hidden, a silent ceramic guardian of our little patch of suburbia. He lasted 6 hours. The next morning, another letter was in my mailbox. This time citing Bylaw 91, Section F. All lawn ornamentation, statuary, or decorative figures must be submitted for approval to the Architectural Review Committee, ARC, prior to installation. Carol appeared at my door that evening, this time looking almost sympathetic, in the way a predator might sympathize with its prey's poor survival instincts. "Another violation, Mr. Jensen," she sighed, as if this whole ordeal pained her more than it did me. "It's a gnome, Carol. It's a foot tall. Are you worried he's going to start a tiny ceramic gang?" "It's about process," she said, her voice unshakable. "If we allow one unapproved gnome, what's next? Flamingos? A life-sized replica of Michelangelo's David? There must be order." I looked her dead in the eye. "So if I want to put, say, a rock, just a regular medium-sized rock, by the flower bed, does that need ARC approval?" She didn't miss a beat. "Is the rock native to this region? What are its dimensions, its coloration? It would depend on whether it complemented the community's established aesthetic. A full submission, including geological sourcing and a site plan, would be required." I closed the door, my brain buzzing. She wasn't just a stickler for the rules. She was an artist, and petty bureaucracy was her medium, and that's when I realized my mistake. I had been fighting her on her terms. It was time to fight her on mine. Overwhelming, ridiculous, and technically by-the-book precision. My campaign of malicious compliance began. I submitted a 10-page application for the gnome, complete with a character backstory, a soil impact report, and a light pollution study on the reflective properties of his hat. It was immediately denied for frivolous content. So I moved on. I submitted a 12-page proposal to move a single sprinkler head 2 inches to the left. It included spray radius diagrams, water table impact assessments, and testimonials from my lawn about its desperate need for more efficient hydration in that specific quadrant. I submitted a 7-page request for permission to plant a single marigold, citing its non-invasive root structure and its cheerful, yet not ostentatious, hue. I followed every rule. I filled out every form in triplicate. I drowned them in the very paperwork they worshipped. My mailbox became a war zone of approvals, denials, and requests for clarification. I was pretty sure Carol's eye had started twitching whenever she saw my house number. It was a Cold War, fought with paper and postage, and I was having the time of my life. Then, the weather forecast changed, and our little war was about to get a whole lot less cold. A low-pressure system in the Atlantic had blossomed into a tropical storm, and then, with terrifying speed, into a Category 3 hurricane named Isabel. The spaghetti models on the news, which usually showed a dozen possible paths, were in ominous agreement. The cone of uncertainty was centered directly on our coastline, on our city, on Harmony Creek Estates. Mandatory evacuation orders were expected within 48 hours. The neighborhood, usually so quiet, was buzzing with a nervous energy. The thwack of storm shutters being installed, the hum of generators being tested. I was in my garage, sorting through my own prep kits, when my next-door neighbor, Dave, wandered over. Dave was a retired accountant, a genuinely nice guy with a perpetually weary expression, as if he'd spent a lifetime crunching the numbers on human folly and found them wanting. "Getting ready for the big one?" he asked, eyeing my neatly organized bins. "Always," I said. "Comes with the job. You can't tell 100,000 screaming fans the show's canceled because you forgot to charge the backup batteries." Dave chuckled. You'll fit in here just fine then. This neighborhood runs on backup batteries and simmering resentment, mostly directed at Carol. I've had a few run-ins, I admitted. He snorted. Only a few, give it time. Last year during that tropical storm, she tried to find me because my storm shutters weren't the approved shade of hurricane white. Mine were off-white canvas. She measured the color difference with a spectrometer she ordered off Amazon. I stared at him. You're kidding. I wish I was, he said, his eyes crinkling. She's a force of nature all her own. Just be careful. When she thinks she's right, there's no line she won't cross. The words hung in the humid air as the first distant rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. I looked from my generator to the darkening sky, a sense of unease settling over me. That evening, as the first bands of rain began to fall, I decided to do something practical. My job is all about safety and logistics. You light up pathways, exits, and potential hazards. It's second nature. I went to my work truck and grabbed a spool of low-profile, battery-powered LED strip lighting. It was weatherproof, subtle, and ran off a small, sealed battery pack that would last for 3 days. I ran a single, clean line of it along the concrete curb in front of my house, and, after getting a grateful nod from Dave, in front of his as well. The light it gave off was a soft, gentle white, just enough to clearly define the edge of the road from the drainage ditch. In the growing dark, with a power outage all but certain, it was a simple, elegant beacon of safety. It was practical, it was helpful, it was sensible, and to Carol, it was a declaration of war. The rain was starting to come down in earnest now, a steady, insistent drumming on the roof. The wind was picking up too, rattling the newly installed storm shutters and making the big oak tree in my front yard sway in a hypnotic, menacing dance. It was the night before the evacuation order was set to go into effect, a tense, liminal space where everyone was just waiting for the inevitable. I was in the kitchen, making a final pot of coffee on the camp stove, when I saw the beam of a flashlight cut through the gloom. It was methodical, sweeping across my lawn before fixing on the soft glow of the LED strip along the curb. Then, the flashlight beam began to bob its way towards my front door. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," I muttered to myself. I opened the door before she could knock. Carol stood there, already decked out in a bright yellow rain slicker, the hood pulled up tight around her face. She looked like the ill-tempered captain of a very, very small ship, and somehow she had managed to keep her sacred binder dry, tucked into a giant Ziploc bag under her arm. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice tight, barely audible over the rising wind. She didn't need to shout. Her entire presence was a siren of disapproval. "Carol?" I replied, my voice deliberately calm. I took a sip of my coffee. "Bit of a night, huh? You're brave to be out in this?" "I am making my final community inspection before the storm's arrival," she announced, as if she were a 4-star general reviewing her troops. Her flashlight beam shot from my face down to the curb, illuminating the LED strip in a circle of harsh, accusatory light. "What is this?" "That," I said, pointing with my mug, "is emergency lighting. It's low voltage, battery-powered. So when the power goes out, people can see the edge of the road and not drive their car into a ditch while evacuating in the middle of a hurricane." I spelled it out slowly, as if explaining the concept of fire to a caveman. Her face, already pinched with concentration, tightened further. "This is an unapproved electrical installation. It is a direct violation of Bylaw 112, Section A, regarding exterior lighting fixtures." I actually laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh. Not really. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated disbelief. The world was ending. A giant, swirling vortex of wind and rain was about to descend on us, and she was quoting bylaws at me. "Carol, it's emergency lighting. For the hurricane," I repeated, enunciating each word. You know, the literal act of God barreling towards us? I'm pretty sure that falls under some kind of force majeure clause. The bylaws make no exception for acts of God, she snapped, her voice rising now. The rain was dripping off the tip of her nose. These lights need to be removed immediately. They constitute a visual nuisance and an unapproved modification to the community landscape. My mind was reeling. A visual nuisance? The single most useful thing on this entire street right now? My sister's taste in boyfriends is a visual nuisance, Carol, I said, my patience finally fraying. This is common sense. This is safety. They're not getting removed. I'd crossed a line. Her entire body went rigid. The binder was clutched so tightly her knuckles were white. If you do not remove this unapproved installation, she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss, the HOA will be forced to take action to remedy the violation. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. I couldn't help but laugh again, a real, full-throated laugh this time. Remedy the violation? What are you going to do, Carol? Write the hurricane a strongly worded letter? Go ahead, give it your best shot. I shook my head, took a final sip of coffee, and stepped back inside, closing the door on her sputtering, rain-soaked indignation. I was convinced it was a bluff, a final, pathetic display of her imaginary power in the face of nature's very real power. No one, not even her, could be that monumentally petty. No one could be that dangerously stupid. I was wrong. An hour later, the world went black. It happened with a sudden, anticlimactic fizz-pop from the transformer down the street, followed by an immense, profound silence. The hum of refrigerators, the glow of streetlights, the flicker of televisions. All of it gone. The only sound was the roar of the wind, a raw, elemental noise that was no longer buffered by the familiar sounds of civilization. The entire street, the entire neighborhood was plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. Well, not entirely. Outside my window, the soft white line of my LED strips glowed, a faint but reassuring pathway through the abyss. It was a comfort, a small island of order in the growing chaos. Dave's house was dark, my house was dark, every house was dark. But that little line of light was there, a silent testament to preparation and common sense. I was doing a final sweep of the house, making sure all the windows were secure, when I saw it. A single point of light moving through the darkness outside. A flashlight. It was bobbing erratically in the wind, moving with a familiar, determined gait. It was Carol. My blood ran cold. No, way, I thought. She wouldn't. It's a hurricane. People need to see. She's just checking things, that's all. She's not actually... I grabbed my phone and started recording through the living room window, the glass vibrating against my hands from the force of the wind. The flashlight beam moved down my driveway and stopped at the curb, right where the battery pack for the lights was tucked away. The figure in the yellow rain slicker bent down. I saw the glint of metal in the flashlight's beam. Wire cutters. She had a pair of industrial-sized wire cutters. My brain couldn't process it. It was like watching a cartoon villain, an act so pointlessly evil it defied logic. This wasn't about property values or bylaws anymore. This was a dangerous, willful act of sabotage in the middle of a natural disaster. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as she fumbled for a moment with the main lead wire. She braced herself against a gust of wind, raised the cutters, and with a decisive, vicious snip, she cut the power. The light died. My beautiful, helpful, sensible line of safety vanished, plunging our section of the street into the same terrifying, complete blackness as everywhere else. Carol stood up. I could just make out her silhouette against the slightly less black sky. She stood there for a second, a small, triumphant figure in her yellow slicker, looking at her handiwork. Then, a gust of wind nearly knocked her off her feet, and she scurried back towards the safety of her own dark house. I stopped recording. For a full minute, I just stood there in the dark, the phone in my hand, listening to the storm rage outside. The disbelief had evaporated, replaced by a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long, long time. It was a cold, clear, and utterly focused fury. She hadn't just crossed a line, she had cut it. I looked out the window into the terrifying, impenetrable darkness she had created. Then I glanced towards my garage, where my Ford F-250, my work truck, my baby, my mobile arsenal of light and sound was parked. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. It wasn't a happy grin. It was the kind of grin a pyrotechnician gets right before he hits the button for the grand finale. My internal monologue was simple and direct. "Okay, Carol, you want to play by the rules? Let's play. You took away my sensible, low-wattage safety lighting because it was a visual nuisance." "Fine." I walked towards the garage, my footsteps echoing in the dark house. "You get the opening night of a stadium tour package instead." The next 2 minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. This was my world. The wind and rain weren't an obstacle. They were environmental factors to be managed. The darkness wasn't a problem. It was a blank canvas. I moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times in muddy fields and backstage corridors. First, the gear. I threw on my professional-grade rain suit. Heavy-duty Gore-Tex, not some flimsy yellow slicker. Steel-toed work boots. A headlamp that cut a sharp white beam through the oppressive dark. I looked like I was about to go spelunking in hell. Next, the power. I swung open the door to the garage and hit the ignition on the truck. The diesel engine turned over once, twice, and then roared to life. A deep, throaty growl that was a promise of power to come. I flipped a series of switches on a control panel mounted in the cab. With a heavy clunk, the truck's power takeoff engaged, diverting the engine's force from the wheels to the massive 15,000-watt diesel generator bolted to the chassis. The steady growl of the engine escalated into a deafening industrial roar, a sound that didn't just cut through the storm, it dominated it. The garage was instantly filled with the smell of diesel and the vibration of pure, unadulterated power. I jumped out of the cab and went to the back of the truck. With practiced movements, I unstrapped and lowered the outriggers, planting the truck's feet firmly on the driveway for stability. Then I turned to my cargo. My passengers for this particular show were 2 Wanco portable light towers. To the uninitiated, they look like oversized, awkward boxes on wheels. I knew them as my beautiful, light-breathing dragons. Each one consisted of a heavy base containing the controls, a 30-foot telescoping pneumatic mast, and, at the very top, a bank of 4 250-watt metal halide floodlights. Each tower, on its own, could turn a full-sized football field into a passable imitation of daytime. I had 2. Unlatching the first one, I rolled it down the driveway with a grunt. The wind fought me, trying to push it back, but it was too heavy, too solid. I positioned it on the right side of my lawn, angling it to cover the entire cul-de-sac from my house to the street's main intersection. My headlamp beam danced across the control panel, outriggers down, mast unlocked, safety pins clear. I grabbed the pneumatic switch. With a great hiss of compressed air, the mast began to rise. Section by section, it climbed into the stormy sky, a slender metal finger pointing at the angry, swirling clouds. Up it went, 10 feet, 20, 30, until it locked into place, the light bank swaying gently in the gale high above. 1 down. I sprinted back to the truck, grabbed the second tower, and wheeled it to the left side of my driveway, positioning it to cover the street entrance, and, more specifically, the front of a certain beige-colored house directly across from mine. I repeated the setup process, my hands moving surely over the controls despite the driving rain. Outriggers, mast, lock. The second tower hissed its way to its full height, 2 metal sentinels now standing guard over my lawn. The final step. I ran the heavy-duty power cables from the towers back to my truck's generator, locking the thick plugs into their waterproof sockets with a satisfying twist. I did a final quick check. Everything was stable. Everything was connected. I stood between the 2 towers, rain plastering my hair to my forehead, the roar of the generator a symphony in my ears. I took a deep, steadying breath and looked across the street at Carol's house. A black hole of sanctimonious darkness. "Showtime," I whispered. I walked back to the generator's main control panel on the truck. There were 2 large industrial toggle switches, clearly labeled Tower 1 and Tower 2. I placed a hand on each. For a split second, I thought about the sheer, glorious absurdity of what I was about to do. Then I thought about Carol, on her knees in the mud, cutting a safety line with a pair of wire cutters. The hesitation vanished. I flipped them both at the same time. There was a low, electric hum, a deep thrumming that vibrated through the soles of my boots. The bulbs in the 8 massive floodlights flickered once, twice, a hesitant, ghostly blue, and then, with a sound like the world's biggest camera flash going off, a sharp, percussive whump, they ignited. The concept of darkness ceased to exist on my street. It wasn't just light, it was a physical presence, an overwhelming, all-consuming tidal wave of pure, white illumination that blasted away the night. The street, the houses, the thrashing trees, everything was instantly rendered in hyper-realistic, bleached-out detail. It was brighter than noon on a cloudless day. I saw individual raindrops frozen in the air, each one a perfect, glittering diamond. The wet asphalt of the street shimmered like a river of mercury. My neighbor's off-white canvas's storm shutters looked like they had been freshly painted with titanium white. I had to throw a hand up to shield my own eyes from the glare. The sheer intensity was staggering. 8,800 watts of remedied violation were now pouring down on Harmony Creek Estates. The roar of the generator provided the soundtrack, a throbbing, relentless bass line for my symphony of light. Slowly, signs of life appeared. Curtains twitched. A door opened down the street, and a man peered out, his face a mask of confusion, as if he'd woken up from a coma to find the sun had parked on his lawn. Then, Dave's front door creaked open. He stood there in his bathrobe, blinking like a bewildered owl. He looked at the light tower on my lawn. He looked at the other light tower. He looked at the truck, thrumming with power. He looked at me, standing there like a rain-soaked conductor who had just orchestrated the dawn. His jaw dropped. For a solid 10 seconds he was speechless. Then he threw his head back and let out a roar of helpless, hysterical laughter that was almost loud enough to be heard over the generator. But my attention was focused on one house, the house directly across the street. Carol's house. It was no longer beige. It was a searing, brilliant white. The light was so powerful it was passing straight through her drawn curtains, illuminating the interior of her home like a movie set. I could see the distinct silhouette of her ficus plant. And then another silhouette appeared in the main window. It was her. I could see the outline of her helmet hair perfectly. A hand came up to shield her eyes. She stood there, a shadow trapped in a box of inescapable light, her body rigid with what I could only imagine was a combination of rage, horror, and pure, uncomprehending shock. She had wanted to control the light. Now she was drowning in it. The sight was so beautiful, so profoundly, poetically just, that I almost didn't notice the new lights approaching from the end of the street. They were red and blue, and they were flashing, but their urgent strobing was almost completely washed out, pathetic little flickers against the sheer, overwhelming power of my personal suns. A police cruiser crawled down the street, the two officers inside leaning forward, squinting through the windshield. It pulled up at the end of my driveway, and two cops got out, looking utterly and completely bewildered. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered officer, put his hand up to block the glare and began walking towards me. He had to shout to be heard over the generator. "Sir," he yelled, his voice a mixture of authority and sheer disbelief, "can you please tell me what in the Sam Hill is going on here?" I gave the officer a calm, neighborly nod. This was no different than dealing with a venue manager or a fire marshal. The key was to be respectful, professional, and have all your paperwork, or in this case, your digital evidence, in order. "Evening, officer!" I shouted back, gesturing towards the generator. "1 second!" I walked over to the truck, and with a heavy-hearted sigh for the interruption, killed the power to the towers. The 8 massive lights flickered and died. The sudden plunge back into darkness was even more shocking than the light had been. The world snapped back to the dim, stormy reality, lit only by the cruiser's flashing lights and the officers' heavy-duty flashlights. The roar of the generator spooled down to the truck's comparatively quiet diesel hum. The silence felt immense. Just as the first officer reached me, another figure came scurrying out from across the street. It was Carol, no longer in her slicker, but now wrapped in a bathrobe, her hair slightly askew. Her face was a thunderous mask of fury. "Arrest him!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He's violating every noise ordinance there is. This is illegal. This is an unapproved industrial installation." The first officer held up a hand to stop her. "Ma'am, please, let me handle this." He turned his flashlight beam from my face to hers and back again. "Okay, can someone please start from the beginning? And please talk one at a time." Carol started sputtering, a torrent of bylaw numbers, decibel levels, and accusations of deliberate harassment. I waited patiently until she paused for breath. Then I looked at the officer. "Officer, good evening." "Awful weather," I began, my voice deliberately level and calm. "My name is Alex Jensen. I live here. A few hours ago, in preparation for the hurricane evacuation, I installed a single strip of low-voltage, battery-powered LED lights along the curb so my neighbors and I could see to get out safely when the power failed." I paused, letting that sink in. "The HOA president, Miss Davison here," I said, gesturing politely to Carol, "came to my door and told me they were a violation and demanded I remove them. I explained they were a temporary safety measure. She then threatened to remedy the violation herself." The officer looked at Carol, who crossed her arms, her expression defiant. "It was an unapproved modification," she snapped. I ignored her and continued. "About an hour ago, the power went out. Miss Davison then took it upon herself to come onto my property with wire cutters and deliberately disable my emergency lighting, creating a serious safety hazard for myself and my neighbors during a mandatory evacuation order." The two cops exchanged a look. The second, younger officer raised an eyebrow. "Do you have any proof of that, sir?" the first officer asked, his tone shifting from annoyed to interested. "As a matter of fact, I do," I said. I pulled out my phone, which I had tucked safely inside my jacket. I swiped to the video, turned up the brightness, and handed it to him. The two cops huddled around the small screen. The video was clear, even in the dark. They watched the little figure in the yellow slicker. They saw the glint of the wire cutters. They saw the decisive snip. They saw the lights go out. And they saw her stand up looking satisfied with her work. The whole thing took maybe 30 seconds. The first officer handed the phone back to me. He was very, very quiet for a moment. I could see the muscles in his jaw working as he tried to maintain a professional expression. He was failing. A small smile was fighting its way to the surface. He turned to Carol. His voice was no longer friendly. It was cold and hard. "Ma'am, is what I just saw on that video accurate? Did you knowingly disable a neighbor's emergency lighting during a state of emergency?" "It was a bylaw violation," she insisted, her voice cracking slightly. "He was warned." "Ma'am," the officer said, taking a step closer to her, "this is a hurricane. The bylaws of your homeowners association are not the law of the land. What you did was reckless. You tampered with private property and created a genuine danger. If someone had fallen or driven into that ditch because they couldn't see, you could be held liable. Do you understand me?" Carol's face went pale. All the righteous indignation seemed to drain out of her. She just stood there, clutching her bathrobe, looking small and ridiculous. The officer turned back to me. "And you, sir, this was your solution?" He gestured vaguely at the two massive dark towers on my lawn. "Yes, officer," I said with a straight face. "She created a safety hazard. I simply rectified the situation with the professional-grade equipment I have on hand. I made sure the area was safely illuminated for the remainder of the evacuation period." He stared at my face, then at the towers, then back at my face. He bit his lip, and I saw his shoulders shake once with a suppressed laugh. "Right," he said, finally composing himself. "Well, your solution is a bit on the loud side. We've had a few calls. I'm not going to cite you for a noise violation under the circumstances, but can you keep it off unless you absolutely need it?" "Of course, officer. Safety first," I said solemnly. He nodded, then turned back to Carol. "Ma'am, I suggest you go inside and stay there. Do not interact with your neighbor again tonight. We will be filing a report on this incident." Without another word, Carol turned and scurried back to her house, the very picture of defeated tyranny. The officers got back in their cruiser, gave me one last, long, incredulous shake of the head, and drove off into the storm. I stood alone in the rain for a moment, the quiet victory sinking in. Then I went inside, dried off, and slept like a baby. The storm passed by dawn, leaving behind a world that was washed clean and littered with fallen branches. The power was still out, but the sun was shining. When I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, the neighborhood was already buzzing. Dave was the first to greet me, a massive grin on his face. "You, my friend," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, "are an absolute legend. A madman, but a legend." Over the next hour, a steady stream of neighbors stopped by. People I'd only ever waved to before came over to thank me. One woman brought me a plate of still warm banana bread she'd baked on her gas stove. Another man, who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac, told me he'd been about to pull out of his driveway and had nearly veered into the ditch before I'd turned on the sun. I was a local hero, all because I'd responded to petty madness with overwhelming theatrical logic. Across the street, Carol's house was silent. The curtains remained drawn, a beige fortress of shame. I knew the war wasn't over. She would be back, armed with fines and lawyers and her accursed binder. My light tower solution had been temporary, a beautiful, brilliant flash in the pan. I needed something permanent, something legal, something that was, ironically, 100% HOA compliant. That afternoon I made a call. The next day, a shiny truck from Aesthetic Lighting and Landscape Design pulled into my driveway. Two guys hopped out, a grizzled older man named Sal and a young, eager techie named Marco. I led them out to my front lawn and unrolled a set of blueprints on the hood of their truck. "Here's the plan," I began, my voice filled with a newfound creative zeal. "I want a permanent, hardwired, low-voltage landscape lighting system. I want it to be the most beautiful, tasteful, and elegant lighting job you have ever done. It needs to highlight the architecture of the house, the birch tree here, the stone pathway there. It needs to be subtle. It needs to be art. Sal nodded, looking impressed. I like it. We can do that. High-end fixtures, warm color temperature, fully automated. And, I said, cutting him off, holding up a finger, it needs to be 100% compliant with every single HOA bylaw, down to the wattage of the bulbs and the burial depth of the conduit. I want the paperwork submitted in triplicate. I want it to be so unimpeachably by the book that Carol Davison herself couldn't find a single thing wrong with it if she used an electron microscope. Marco grinned. A challenge. We like a challenge. There's one more thing, I said, leaning in closer. I want it all run through a smart controller with a custom-programmed app. There will be multiple settings. Evening, midnight, welcome home. But I also want you to create one special custom preset. This preset, when activated, will overdrive every fixture to 150% of its rated power for a 10-second burst. I want you to design a system that is beautiful and tasteful, but is also capable, at the single tap of a button, of being, and I quote, brighter than the surface of the sun. Sal and Marco looked at each other. The same slow, wicked grin I'd felt in my garage spread across both of their faces. Sir, Sal said, a newfound reverence in his voice, we were born for this job. The emergency HOA meeting was held 2 weeks later in the community clubhouse. The air was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. Carol, having regained her composure and apparently forgotten her public humiliation, was back in her element. She sat at the head of the table, her binder open, her face set in a mask of grim determination. The main agenda item, of course, was me. So, Carol concluded, after a 10-minute monologue detailing my various transgressions. For the unapproved industrial installation, the egregious noise violation, and the general endangerment of the community aesthetic, I move that Mr. Alex Jensen be fined the maximum allowable amount of $5,000. A murmur went through the 20 or so homeowners crammed into the small room. A $5,000 fine was unprecedented. Carol looked at me, a smug, triumphant glint in her eye. Does anyone second the motion? The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, a hand went up. It was Dave. I'd like to say something, he said, his voice calm and steady. He stood up, and all eyes turned to him. I, for one, will not be seconding that motion. In fact, I think we should be giving Alex a medal. On the night of the hurricane, when our president here decided that a bylaw was more important than her neighbor's safety, Alex lit up the street so people could see. She created a hazard. He pointed a finger directly at Carol. He provided a solution. Another homeowner, the woman who had brought me banana bread, stood up. Dave's right. My husband is a volunteer firefighter. When he heard what Carol did, he was furious. You don't interfere with safety measures during an emergency. Ever. Suddenly, the dam broke. One by one, homeowners stood up, not to condemn me, but to condemn Carol. They brought up years of petty fines, of nonsensical rules, of her tyrannical reign over the color of their mailboxes and the height of their grass. It was a full-blown suburban revolt. Carol sat there, her face turning from beige to a blotchy, furious red. She banged her gavel. This is not on the agenda! This is out of order! I'll tell you what's out of order, Dave boomed, his voice filling the room. Your leadership. I'd like to make a new motion. A motion for a vote of no confidence in our current HOA president. Seconded, came a chorus of voices. The result was a landslide. Carol was stripped of her title, her power, her precious binder, right there in the clubhouse. She packed her things in stunned silence and stormed out without another word. The Beige Queen had been dethroned. A few weeks later, my new lighting system was installed. It was, as promised, a work of art. At dusk, A series of warm, elegant lights would automatically fade on, casting a gentle, welcoming glow on my house. It was tasteful, beautiful, and so impeccably compliant with HOA regulations that the approval paperwork had sailed through the newly elected committee, now headed by a much more reasonable Dave. I was sitting on my porch one evening, enjoying the hard-won peace and quiet, a cold beer in my hand. I pulled out my phone and opened the custom lighting app Sal and Marco had designed. I scrolled past the presets for evening glow and dinner party. I stopped at the bottom, at a custom button they had added, labeled simply, The Carol. My finger hovered over it. A smile touched my lips. I looked across the street at Carol's house. Her curtains were drawn, as they usually were these days. I tapped the button. For 10 glorious seconds, my entire property blazed with a light so pure and intense it felt like a religious experience. The lawn, the trees, the house itself were bathed in a brilliant stadium-level flood of white light. It was a silent, magnificent testament to the principle of overwhelming force. Then, as quickly as it came, it faded back to its gentle, tasteful glow. Across the street, a curtain twitched. I took a long, satisfying sip of my beer. Harmony, I had discovered, was not about the absence of conflict. It was about having a bigger, brighter, and fully compliant switch than your opponent. Peace and quiet, achieved through the strategic application of overwhelming lumens. I could definitely get used to this kind of boring.